Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to our latest Keeping It Real webinar. In today's webinar, we'll be asking the question, what is the point of real-world evidence? I'm Emma Bagshaw. I'm a senior medical writer here at ViteAccess, and I'll be hosting the session. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. So today I'm joined by Mark Larkin, Akosua Ofori, and Jeff Trotter. Mark is the founder and the CEO of ViteAccess. He has over 20 years of experience in HUR and real-world evidence consulting. Mark founded ViteAccess with the aim of harnessing the power of digital technology to better represent patients' voices in drug development and market access. Akosua is an associate consultant here at ViteAccess. She's a key contributor to the success of our patient-centered and real-world studies, with a role that spans project management, materials development, research, and analysis. And today we're joined by our guest speaker, Jeff Trotter. Jeff is a real pioneer in the field of real-world evidence. He has a wealth of experience from across the product lifespan in the pharmaceutical and the medical device industries. And he now specializes in providing strategic and operational guidance for real-world research and evidence generation programs. Right, let's see what we've got in store today. I'll begin the session by introducing ViteAccess and how we fit into the real world of real-world evidence. I'll then hand over to Mark and Akosua, who will provide a brief introduction to real-world evidence and what the term encompasses. They'll then get to the question at the heart of today's webinar: what is the point of real-world evidence? Why is it useful, and in which situations can it bring most valuable? To provide some real-life examples, they'll be taking you through a few case studies that we've worked on here at ViteAccess. In the second half of the webinar, we're going to get more practical, considering some of the operational, methodological, and scientific challenges associated with generating real-world evidence. And we're going to talk about how to approach tackling those. So the format for that half of the webinar will be a group discussion between the three panelists, with Akosua and Mark picking the brains of our guest expert, Jeff. If you too have any questions for either Jeff or our other panelists, please feel free to submit them at any time. You should be able to see a Q&A box in the webinar panel, so you can type them in there at any point. We'll aim to answer them towards the end of today's session, but if we don't get a chance, then we'll get back to you via email. Okay, let's start. Sorry, my slides are in the wrong order there, with a brief introduction to ViteAccess. We are a patient-centric research organisation, and we specialise in real-world evidence generation. So we work closely with our pharma and biotech clients to design and execute research projects that put patients and their caregivers first. We believe that the best way to learn about someone's experiences is to talk to them, which is why the majority of our research involves at least some degree of patient or caregiver self-reported data. So this may be, for example, via an online survey that asks caregivers about their quality of life, or an app that collects monthly data from patients about their experiences of living with their condition. We can then link the patient and caregiver data together and then draw in clinician-reported data from the patient's medical record. And through that, we can start to build up a really rich picture of the patient's real-world experiences of managing their condition, dealing with their treatments, their journey, and how they feel and their symptoms, and just how their condition really affects them. So our key experiences in these areas that you see on screen here: patient-centered outcomes, real-world evidence, analytics, and localization. And what we do is we bring these functions together in one place, which enables us to design and run global patient-focused studies that generate reliable and relevant data. I think that's about all about us for now. So I will hand you over to our speakers to begin the discussion with an overview of real-world evidence. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So first of all, we'll start with a brief overview of what real-world evidence, or RWE, is. So next slide, please, Emma. One topic that we often find ourselves discussing here at Bytaxis is the difference between these two terms, because they're often used interchangeably when you read about them. But just to be crystal clear for the purposes of this session, is that real-world data is a data available about a patient's health status or healthcare delivery that's collected in a real-world setting, and therefore outside of a randomized control trial or a clinical trial setting. Alternatively, real-world evidence is the clinical evidence derived from real-world data, so through the processing and the analysis of real-world data regarding the use, potential benefits, and all risks associated with the medical product. So that's just to make that distinction clear from the beginning. Next slide, please. So now moving on to some of the sources of real-world data. So you can see some examples there on the left-hand side of the screen. So these are data that are collected in a real-world everyday setting. And some are paper-based, so medical claims data, surveys, but you can also see some digital examples as well, such as electronic health records and wearables. And this table on the right here aims to illustrate some key differences between randomized control trials and real-world studies. So as you can see, or as you will know, randomized control trials are characterized by patient visits and procedures that are mandated by protocols. So patients often go into a site and data is collected about them there. Whereas in a real world study, it aims to reflect real world standard of care. So although it will follow a protocol, it will be reflective of the clinical practice regarding the condition that it's relating to. RCTs tend to be hypothesis testing, whereas real-world studies tend to be hypothesis generating. So from the based on the data that comes out of them, hypotheses can be formed, and the research questions tend to be more open. For RCTs, you'll know that there are often very detailed and long inclusion and exclusion criteria when it comes to selecting patients, whereas in real-world studies, these are kept minimal to aim to reflect clinical practice as much as possible. RCTs often have objective clinical endpoints that are specified as outcomes for the trial, whereas for real-world studies, these are outcomes that are of most relevance to the patient, clinical team or caregivers. And finally, where RCTs generate data that can demonstrate treatment efficacy, real-world data can, or real-world evidence can demonstrate overall effectiveness of the treatment. Next slide, please, Emma. So next we'll discuss what some of the potential benefits of real-world evidence are. So owing to the slightly looser inclusion-exclusion criteria that I mentioned and the aim for the studies to reflect real-world practice, real-world evidence can often reach broader and more diverse patient populations, especially those that aren't well represented in clinical trials. And this enables researchers to have a more improved understanding of subpopulations that might not be able to be explored through clinical trials. Secondly, having a broader range of participants with different experiences allows an exploration of a broader range of treatment scenarios and potential comparisons compared to those available in literature. Thirdly, real-world evidence can provide unique insights into the patient experience and journey in a more holistic method. So you get more insight into real-life challenges, such as the impact of a disease on productivity and day-to-day disease management that might not come up in a clinical trial setting. And finally, clinicians can use real-world evidence to provide additional insights to treatment effectiveness to complement RCT data when it comes to decision making. Next slide, please, Emma. So in terms of why real-world evidence is being increasingly demanded from decision makers, it's clear that this is coming from both a regulatory side and an HTA and PNR side. So from the regulatory side, the FDA has launched the Real-World Evidence Program in 2018, which emphasizes the potential use real-world evidence to support label changes for already approved drugs. And in terms of how it's used in submissions, it's been used in over 90 medical device regulatory decisions to date. And in terms of HTA, NICE has very clear frameworks for how they aim to use real-world evidence in the submissions that they assess, and also some guidance for sponsors or people submitting to NICE on how or what is best practice when planning, conducting, and reporting real-world data or real-world evidence studies. Next slide, please, Emma. I'll now hand you over to Mark to take you through when to use real-world evidence.
Thanks, Akosua. So this slide, I'm not going to take you through all the detail, but I'm just going to orient you a little bit. This is from our friends IMI Get Real, put this together a little while ago. Really, the take-homes for this are that if you look at along the x-axis from pre-launch, launch, and then way after launch, there's a whole range of different use cases, if you like, for real-world evidence. And within real-world evidence, of course, there's a whole range of different ways of doing it. It could be claims data, as Akosua alluded to. In the following case studies, actually, we're going to talk about how we've done prospective studies where we're generating real-world evidence. But even in that subset of real-world evidence, we see quite a few different use cases depending on where the sponsor is in the development of their product, pre-launch, post-launch, or even within that, very specific and different use cases. So, you know, look at these for yourself in terms of the evidence required, some of the examples during the product development, growth phase, and maturity. And the other thing that's this slide shows quite nicely is that there's a difference. This is dynamic. So perhaps formerly there was a need for real-world evidence. If you look at the dotted line around about launch, perhaps, but now what we're seeing is a whole range of different use cases right into the distance post-launch, I think that just illustrates really the plethora of opportunities for the use of real-world evidence done in the right way. So if you go to the next one then, please, Emma.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt you there, Mark. Sorry. Yes, you should see a poll coming up on screen now. If you wouldn't mind helping us by responding to that poll. So the question is asking, how is real-world evidence currently being used in your organisation? So Mark's talked through a lot of potential use cases for RWE there. But it'd be interesting to know from the audience, are you using RWE at the moment? Are you using it in the ways that Mark's described, or any other ways? So I'll just give people a second to respond there. And then you should be able to bring up the answers in a second. Answer with the greatest number of responses is to support commercialization, so market access and HUR, which I suppose, Mark, aligns with what you were saying about the previous uses of real-world evidence. It is still being used around launch to support market access. Maybe people are still sort of working in that way, but we're also getting a lot of what you said beyond that time point to support label expansion. We've got a lot of people have said that they're using RWE there, and then to a lesser extent in the earlier stages, so to support clinical development through a simulated control arm or through refining the protocol, working out how to recruit patients and sites, and to complement RCTs. So yeah, I suppose it aligns with what you said there, Mark. Greatest use, support commercialization, maybe around the time of launch, a little bit more being used after launch and pre-launch, but still not as much as around that time of launch. So interesting results there. Okay, let's close that, and then we will move on to, if I can get it there, some case studies. Okay, I'll hand back over to Akosua and Mark for these.
Yeah, so case studies, thanks Emma. So case studies, we've just got a handful here to really illustrate some of the variety that we've seen in terms of the designs that we do. And as I said, we typically are a subset of real-world evidence, which is about generating new data. Why do you generate it? Well, you've got a gap, you've got an uncertainty where you can't find other data that may be able to, that exists already that you might be able to use. This is a study that we launched, and these are public, where you see logos, these are public studies. So this is in a rare disease, myasthenia gravis, with our friends at Argenx. and we help them build up a pretty granular understanding of the burden of disease. This is pre-launch. Their drugs now being subsequently approved. And burden of disease meant a whole range of different things that you see there in terms of the background. So we had we designed a observational study. The data capture was from patients using a smartphone app, so BYOD, and that enabled us to do quite a lot of things. One was to administer a whole row of different PRO instruments corresponding to different domains that the sponsor wanted to know about. There was also things like trackers that would help understand health resource utilization and disease burden and changes in current treatment. So really granular information that we're able to get directly from patients. And just in terms of value, I mean, this is it was quite a long study, but very granular data set, which was we think very valuable. And the data to help prepare for market access, market launches, and reimbursement submissions. So highlighted a couple of these, and again, these are public, but information for their ICER submission, and then you can look all this up. But this is all going through NICE at the moment as well. So data from this study was used to support a whole range of aspects of the submission in terms of characteristics of the patient population. Utilities data went into their economic modelling, treatment patterns of the patient cohort in the UK for that submission, but this was global to 10 countries: North America, Japan, Europe. And then resource use all the way through to caregiver disutilities even. So I'd characterize this as being a very powerful, flexible resource that the company builds. Next one then, please. Very different study in IME, still patients and caregivers generating the data, but in a very different setting, peanut allergy, so food allergies. So challenge here was that actually away from clinical sites, the burden of the incidence of exposure to allergens was quite poorly understood. It was subject to recency and recall biases when people were in sites. So it's not being routinely collected risked perhaps it being the true prevalence of exposure to allergens being underestimated. So what we did was in some ways quite simple, but hadn't really been done before, which was to try and make the capturing of data in patients and caregivers' everyday lives as simple as possible. It couldn't be burdensome or people wouldn't do it. So what we came down upon was within our platform, we've got an SMS notification module, which sounds very old school actually, but SMSs work really nicely. So patients and caregivers received a weekly SMS, and all they had to do was, if they'd been exposed to an allergen in the last 7 days, they clicked through to another survey, didn't have to log into anything, clicked through to another survey to understand about that allergic exposure. And if they hadn't been exposed to an allergen, they simply replied to the SMS saying no. So it took seconds, and actually the information about non-exposure is almost as useful as exposure. So really, really easy for patients and caregivers, and that translated in a longitudinal study into fantastic engagement over time, which is one of the holy grails when you're doing prospective studies. And if you click on the video, Emma, you can see, hopefully everyone can see this. This gives you a little idea of what it looks like. You're a patient, you're a caregiver, you receive your SMS, which you haven't turned off, and the SMS asks you about your allergy exposure, and if you say yes, you click through, you give a bit more information. But actually the whole episode takes maybe a minute or two. No logging in, no emails, replying, anything like that. It's really easy. And as I said, that translated to really exceptional completion rates that we found for this study. So if you want to carry on then, I'll pass back, I think, to Akosua.
Thanks, Mark. So moving on to a different case study. So this was a sponsor whose treatment was in oncology, and they wanted to understand the real-world experiences of patients that are receiving their oncology treatment. So essentially capturing the patient experience from treatment initiation. So the drug is currently available in clinical practice, so towards the end of that diagram that Mark showed earlier. And their aim was to collect real-world evidence, generate real-world evidence to strengthen the value proposition and aid in decision-making, so to complement their RCT data with real-world data. So it's a prospective observational longitudinal study, and it's multi-center. The main component of this study is that it has two parts. It has a clinician ECRF, so we ask sites to collect data about the patient's treatment history, progression, treatment status, adverse events, and then this is complemented with the patient component. So these are app-based surveys on quality of life using validated instruments. So the two sources of data, if you like, go hand in hand to provide an overview of the patient's experience from treatment initiation and over a 2-year period. So the value of this study in particular is that, as mentioned, it provides a comprehensive picture of patients' experience, both from the clinician perspective, so giving you that rigor and, you know, using EHR data, but then also the benefits of the patient reported experience as well. And as this is a digital study, similar to the ones that Mark explained, that has benefits in terms of the speed of data access and publication. So we're able to conduct the study, get data from the study and publish much quicker. And also it makes it more convenient to the patient who doesn't need to go into the hospital in order to have this data collected about them. And as Mark mentioned, it allows you to get more granular detail about someone's experience. Thanks, Emma. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks everyone. Right, we're going to move on to the second half of the webinar now, which is where we're going to put Jeff on the spot. So we're going to open it up to Akosua and Mark. They prepared a few questions to ask Jeff. And as I said previously, we're going to be sort of focusing on the operational, the practical side of things. How do you actually go about conducting a real world study? What are the potential obstacles there, and what are some ways that you might approach those, ways that you might find solutions to those challenges? So guys, I will hand it over to you.
Cool, thanks Emma. So I'll start with the operational and organizational challenges of implementing real world evidence studies. So the first question for you, Jeff, is how is real world evidence or real world studies managed within sponsor companies, and which teams tend to be responsible for that? Because that can vary from company to company as we're aware.
My answer is yes, because it's a moving target. I mean, I was thinking about the poll, for example, the poll question that was asked. A lot of those use cases didn't exist a handful of years ago. So pharma companies, biotech companies, and medical device companies are all kind of grappling organizationally with the optimal approach to addressing, real world data and real world evidence. And yeah, it varies, I think, by size of company. It varies by even therapeutic mix of products, by development status, etc. But by and large, it's going to be somewhere on the continuum between the traditional land masses of clinical development and commercialization. I've walked that tightrope between those two land masses for 100 years now, and it's an interesting place. But real world evidence, I think, is something that is binding or is uniting organizations better than it ever has, because it does have applications on the clinical side, certainly has applications on the commercial side. So who is best to deal with those data provenance issues, data access issues, quality of the data, generating data? And I think more and more it's expected that medical affairs, health economics and outcomes research, people that are kind of on that continuum, but in the middle. And there are some organizations that are developing RWEs, COEs, real world evidence centers of excellence. And I think actually that's a very good idea, because it almost is an internal consultative role in ensuring that the rest of the organization is using real world data and real world evidence in an optimal manner. So I think, yeah, my non-answer is kind of somewhere in between clinical and commercial, with medical affairs, with health economics, and increasingly kind of a real world evidence center of excellence.
Yeah, it's really interesting, particularly the center of excellence aspect as well. And
I've made up my own title that companies should have, called a chief evidence officer, and there's a lot of implications about that, because I think this is important for organizations to use this data asset strategically and scientifically, and it really needs to, come from a C-level level of authority. So I've made that up, but I'm thinking that function may exist in many companies, this chief evidence officer concept. Sorry, Akosua.
Yeah, no, I like that. My next question is, it kind of links to the first one, but in terms of considering the operational requirements of running a real world evidence part of the business or conducting real world evidence studies, how do you think that compares to conducting RCTs or your traditional sort of clinical studies?
Night and day is a little bit too cavalier, but it truly is different. I mean, again, within the real world evidence realm, there's accessing existing data, which is a skill set that, maybe clinical development doesn't necessarily have, or really nobody has all that much of. And then there's generating real world evidence through for example, some of the initiatives that you and Mark articulated. It's the bad metaphor I've been using for 100 years is that randomized clinical trials are like big 18-wheel trucks. They're fit for a specific purpose. They carry a very specific load, and contextually, therefore, entirely done for regulatory approval. Whereas a real-world evidence initiative is more of a sports car with a tighter turning radius. It's built for a completely different purpose. It's operationalized as efficiently as possible. The other metaphor I use, which relates to this bad automotive metaphor, is that randomized clinical trials are kind of the automotive test track, where all conditions are perfect, and you've got the same drivers, the same grade of petrol that you're using. Whereas the real world is more of the New Jersey Turnpike, if you will, where you just can't predict what's going to happen, and so you need different drivers, you need different skill sets. It gets down to issues of protocol development, of analytical rigor, of statistical rigor, of operational issues in terms of who's going to be involved and how we can interact most optimally with the various participants, and as well as some of the important limitations of the analytical data coming out of these programs. So dramatically different approach is my quick summary from an operational standpoint.
Let me just chuck something in as well. I was having a discussion with a client recently, and they said that in their company, they basically hadn't done too much in terms of real world evidence because they were quite risk averse. And I thought that was very interesting. And yet, given the huge variety of what we're talking about, that how can one simplify to those terms? Because actually, there's certain use cases, I would argue, of real world evidence studies that are going to reduce risk. Then you're going to help know things and mitigate risks of maybe your clinical development program, etc. So I don't know, I was just struck by that being quite an oversimplification, given the variety of methodologies and use cases we're talking about.
Well, I'd be surprised if there wasn't incremental value and reduced risk in accessing real world information at any scenario, because I mean, even as Akosua said earlier on, some of the legislative moves that really have encouraged the use of real world data are really important. I mean, the 21st Century Cures Act in the US acknowledged that randomized clinical trials are great. They're perfect experiments, but the real world is real different. And if we really want to supply information for optimal medical decision making with real patients that may have been appropriately excluded from clinical trials, we've got to do something different. So at the very least, real world data and real world evidence complements the very robust experiments from randomized clinical trials, and therefore provides extremely useful information of what's happening out there. What's happening out there really needs to be monitored, certainly from a safety standpoint, but also in terms of new potential indications. We may find that there's great outcomes in an area that really wasn't formally invested in from a clinical development standpoint, and that there's no downside to that information. So yeah, the real world is real messy, but real important at the same time.
Great, thank you. My next question is around, so if you go back to the beginning, if a company was considering if they wanted to conduct a real world study, a lot of companies don't know how or why they will use the data. So what would you say that companies need to consider before committing to running a real world study and generating real world evidence?
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase it, Akosua. And I agree. I think this is new for many organizations. So the disconnect between how we might issues that we want to explore and how we might explore those issues methodologically, is a big issue. I will say that a lot of companies come to me and say, hey, we're thinking about doing a study, and that's kind of it. And so yeah, backing the train up to the station, saying, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? What questions are we trying to explore? What issues are we trying to address? What does a quote unquote successful real world evidence initiative look like a couple of years from now? And maybe let's work backwards from there to figure out the right way to do it. There are so many different options these days for how to approach a real world question. But to your point, Akosua, the first step really needs to be defining what the questions are, and that has all sorts of implications on some of the limitations of actually answering a question or quote unquote exploring an issue. So yeah, that's the critical starting point that that we need to work backwards from. Is a real world solution even the right solution for a particular question? So yeah, starting at the questions, I can't emphasize the importance of that more.
Yeah, and just relatedly, I mean, from our perspective, we as Emma mentioned at the start, a lot of the work we do is focused on generating data from patients. Now, although we can do it in a very efficient way, only do that when you really have to, when there's not other data that exist already. So relatedly, there is some flexibility if you are going to do that, but that can sometimes be an embarrassment of riches, and lots of things you could do, but focus on the most important, prioritizing the most important. Have a pilot, make it narrow, make it as quick as you can, learn from it, rather than trying to have grandiose ambitions about putting everything in over a long period of time. Fine if things work out that way, but start small.
Yeah, and the one thing that I also, emphasizing what you just said, Mark, and what I picked up over the presentation was, we talk about real world data, accessing data, and then we talk about generating real world data. And again, a few things. One, data is just going to sit there unless you have a particular intent. It's not even going to be evidence unless you know who that evidence is going to inform or influence. So those are some real basics that sometimes I think people forget about. And as far as accessing real world data, I'm unaware of any kind of routine data sets that includes patient-reported outcomes. So that's not something that, I mean, again, we snap our fingers and say we want to leverage real-world data. Well, your examples really amplify the importance of the reality that patient perspectives aren't routinely part of real-world data sets. And maybe that'll change in the future, but patients are kind of important. So I think your examples are right on target as far as generating useful information from the people that are going to be impacted by diseases.
Yeah, we think about this quite a lot, right? Where patient-reported outcomes instruments can be a valuable differentiator in indications in which there is increasing competition, but perhaps competing clinical development data sets don't provide that differentiation. The sponsor might think, well, actually, we've got this hypothesis that, I don't know, that it's more convenient, there's better quality of life with our drug versus our competitor's drug, but actually the data from the clinic don't say that. So that's one, I think, increasingly big use case. And obviously, if you can do any of those things, commercially hugely valuable. And then, of course, there's other indications where actually the primary endpoint may be a patient-reported outcome. And certainly in many neurological conditions, there's things of that nature related to activities of daily living, etc. So again, just in that really small niche, there's quite a lot of variation.
I once asked a electronic medical record company, if they, well, let me back up. I think clinicians also value information from patients. I mean, clinicians will see a patient once every couple of months or once a quarter or once a year in my case. And maybe my quality of life has suffered for some reason along the way, which could be an early indicator of some kind of issue, medical issue, that perhaps there needs to be an early intervention of. But the EMR company told me that, yeah, we've got a PRO module, and I didn't think they did at all. But that's really useful information for day-to-day medical care, routine medical care. It really should be part of routine medical care, and it really isn't right now. And I think there are some we could spend another hour talking about why that is. The other thing I wanted to point out, Mark, you talk about the questionnaires. Someone told me one day that we're going to really have advanced. The patients are okay with filling out questionnaires, but maybe we're going to have really advanced opportunities to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning and technology, so that there will be an app that looks at the patient's face before and after an intervention and assesses their quality of life. Now, I think that's pushing the envelope quite a bit, but I think the future of really leveraging technology to ensure that we're embracing the patient perspective in as easy a way as possible to minimize their burden. And so yeah, it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, look, as I alluded to when I was speaking, holy grail of doing prospective studies is getting great longitudinal data. And you basically want, one aspect of that is to offer patients what I think of as commercial grade experience. It shouldn't be really boring surveys. So anything that one can do to that is, of course, welcome, and has been embraced in other industries a lot quicker than the biopharma industry. The other thing I don't want to be complacent about the adoption of new technology, but I'm just slightly cautious about the although admittedly huge promise. One of the things that I think about is the many years of discussions that went on in the PRO world around comparability, equivalence, etc. The transition from paper to electronic versions of those surveys. So it seems to me that the change, or the transition from digital surveys to use of AI and faces, etc., although interesting, the how key bodies are going to interpret those data, and again, data to evidence, right? I don't think that's happening anytime quickly.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of it is maximizing the patient's value in participating in one of these programs. What does a change from a 10 on a quality of life scale to a 6 mean to them? So I think there's work to be done in still really ensuring that the patients getting out of participation in these studies as much as possible, they have better insights into their progression, into their history, how they stack up with other patients like them. So yeah, there's a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, and that goes back to anything we can do to engage with patients, to provide it without biasing their ongoing results. But all of them are interested in where they sit relative to the rest of the cohort. When we get feedback from patients, that continually comes up. Tell me how I'm doing. Tell me where I fit in. So if we can use tools to try and do that, that's that will certainly help motivate patients. I'm going to just maybe ask one sort of methodological question, Jeff, related to, there's a whole range of differences between, that we've alluded to, beyond the scope of this discussion, between and we've alluded to them in terms of the methodological rigor of clinical trials versus a whole range of differences in non-interventional studies in terms of things like generalizability, non-randomization. Are those things to be wary of, or are they simply things to understand and ensure that you use appropriately? That's not a very good question, but should they be limiters or opportunities?
Somewhere in between. I mean, they are important issues, and again, randomized clinical trial is a great experiment. It's black and white. It's minimizing or even eliminating the noise so that we can really determine if the impact is because of a particular drug. we can get to that issue in the real world as well. And again, as I said, the real world's real messy. You've got patients who are non-compliant. You've got patients who've got all sorts of comorbidities. And, yeah, great reasons to exclude them from the randomized clinical trials, but they need treatment. They need medical care. So I am not a statistician. I can't speak about the value in large numbers, but I think there is a lot of value in casting in that broadly, looking at the variability of patients, looking even at the variability of how they're treated, how a particular drug is used in a sequence. Is it the first? Is it the second, third? Is it done after certain events happen? So it's complementary to the information we get out of the clinical trials, but we have to be very careful about it because, again, as Akosua said, it's not hypothesis proving or disproving, it's hypothesis generating. There is a lot of value in, however, casting that broadly, finding out what's going on out there, looking at trends that probably there are some, smart statisticians that would say, yeah, that is real. That's a real correlation. What are the predictors of the best outcomes out there? That's something that, you can only do in a real world setting. So yeah, Mark, I don't think it's an opportunity or a limitation. It's somewhere in between, but it's something that we absolutely need to account for so that we're ensuring that we're not making inappropriate conclusions and not making inappropriate statements. And again, regulators are very keen to ensure that if we are trying to talk about the importance of expanded labeling or the possibility of expanded labeling, that we're really serious about where the data comes from. Are there biases intrinsic in how the data are captured? If we address all these things, and again, it's been amazing, developments at the FDA in terms of embracing these challenges. But they're open to embracing the challenges as long as we're really careful on how the data are used, how they're collected, what the provenance of the data are. And yeah, I think again, there's a recognition that it is a different world, but highly complementary to the more black and white and still limited aspects of randomized clinical trials. Again, randomized clinical trials are great, but they're not the real world. So yeah, I'm rambling, but I hope that addressed some of your issues.
No, that's great. Emma, I think we may be running out of time. How are we doing?
I was just about to say, let's open it up to the audience now as well. So if anyone would like to submit a question to any of our panelists, please do so via the chat bar. But at the same time, we'll keep the discussion running between you guys if you'd like to, and I'll just throw in questions from the audience as and when they appear. So yeah, feel free to continue your rambles, Jeff, or if Akosua or Mark, you've got any more questions, then yeah, run through those and I'll just let you know if we get any questions from the audience as well.
Well, look, Jeff, I've got one for you, which is around just early, and this isn't new and about real world evidence, it's about sort of launch planning. Since I've been doing this for more years than I care to remember, there's always the notion of people don't do things quickly enough, and if you're going to do something, actually there's benefits in doing it earlier. For some of the studies that we do that are prospective, I have always think, well, if you are going to do it, this doesn't make much difference in which year, given that you can start things in a narrow way. Surely there's benefits of thinking about complementary data for your clinical trial pretty early. Doesn't mean early huge global studies, but I'm always surprised that people don't, I'm biased of course, but I'm always surprised there aren't more people thinking like that. Why do you think that might be the case, or have you experienced that?
Yeah, maybe you're not getting around as much, Mark. I think people are starting to think that way, but it goes back to one of the questions that we addressed earlier. Organizationally, how are our real world evidence goals and objectives being embraced by the organization? Because yeah, I mean, pharma companies are complicated organizations, but I will agree vociferously with you that the three or four classic use cases, again, early on, let's find out what's happening out there, perhaps to ensure that the product that we have in development is going to address some of those issues. So let's do a natural history study. Let's figure out what's going on out there from a clinical and humanistic and maybe even an economic standpoint. what can we improve upon, requires there to be some real world data. Specifically focusing on what the current status quo is in terms of the standard of care is something that I think I've been involved with scores of studies that are relatively close to launch and approval timeframe, because the status quo is changing, the standard of care is changing. So we want to be as contemporaneous and as current as possible when we do that, let's say, baseline characterization of what's happening out there. And then certainly post-approval, to figure out if the product actually is effective and if patients feel good about it, if there can be an opportunity for cost effectiveness. You need to do those studies. And then the other component of it, which is some of the use cases that clinical development is really keen to embrace, are the ones where, how can I identify patients out there perhaps to populate my clinical trials? Or how can I use real world data as a simulated control arm in a clinical trial, rather than impose a possibility of placebo in a very anxious, rare disease audience? So yeah, I think at a very minimum, this should be on the table so companies can at least assess when it makes sense to augment what they're doing and complement what they're doing with a real world evidence plan of action.
Thanks there. I think we've just got a question come in from our audience, so I'll put that to the panel. Commercial sponsors want return on investment, as you know, particularly improvements in speed, quality, and cost. Where do you think that real-world evidence makes the most difference? So presumably that's referring to those aspects there. Where can real-world evidence give you the greatest return on investment?
I'll dive into that quickly, and then I'd be interested in Mark Akosia's thoughts. Well, I think the C-suite in most pharma companies is hearing a lot about this RWE stuff, and that it is purporting to be able to expedite development, maybe even improve the cost efficiency of clinical development, and fundamentally get products to market so that they can be used by patients quicker. And that's exciting stuff if I'm the CEO of a pharma company. Can I get to market quicker and get market accelerated acceptance quicker? So if indeed real world evidence can help in expediting clinical studies or clinical trials by virtue of, again, simulated control is a good example. If accelerating acceptance is achieved by virtue of understanding what's happening out in the real world and figuring out where we can really optimize the use of this product and accelerate clinical and commercial acceptance, then yeah, that's the ROI issue. And so, but it's interesting. And the last thing I'll say is that I was at a company years and years ago where I was talking about a patient registry, a classic observational program. And I was really excited about the ROI. And I may even have said the ROI on this is outstanding. And they said, well, we don't really use that term around here. That's a little bit too black and white and financial. And I said, well, okay, I thought you're a for-profit company. I'm probably wrong. But anyway, I think it's a reflection of the sometimes discomfort in embracing issues like this. The C-suite is responsible for to the shareholders of an organization, and absolutely should be asking that very question. So I think RWE is a great tool in the new armamentarium of pharma companies. That's my thoughts. Mark?
Yeah, and I'll just maybe add a small thing to that. We talk with sponsors whose objectives for study is quite varied. Recruitment into accelerating clinical trials, for instance, by using an observational piece of work to then accelerate those patients then moving into clinical trials. One, actually, and I think the return on it, I mean, there's a lot of variability. The return on investment just for that one thing can justify a study, but actually often there's a whole range of other opportunities to develop an understanding of a condition. Often in these that use cases for quite a rare condition or poorly understood condition, hence patient identification can be challenging, hence the otherwise slow recruitment into clinical trials. So if you are casting your net broader and recruiting patients into some sort of non-interventional program, then don't just think about the recruitment, clinical trial recruitment ROI. take your ROI to the next level by, you know, getting the best bang for your buck with potentially other areas where you can mitigate risk, reduce uncertainty, etc.
Thanks. Right, I'm just aware of time here. We maybe got time for one more question if anyone has a burning topic they'd like to discuss now. I was thinking which is the most difficult question that I can put to Jeff now. Or if you want to go easy on him, we can finish things there. Just let me know.
I mean, I think we've covered most of the, well, we've started covering a range of the topics. You know, I think this sort of discussion shows that hopefully the breadth of discussion. We've only really been able to scratch the surface on a few of these topics, but yeah, maybe to sum up, thinking about things early, thinking about, I think it is worth thinking about things like ROI, thinking about the use, why are you doing this, what are the downstream uses, be extremely clear on that, because that will save you a huge amount of time and money. So even though this might not be an RCT, trying to apply the same level of or a comparable level of rigor and quality is certainly, you know, a key success factor that I would suggest.
Yeah, and Mark, the one thing I'd also say is I mentioned earlier that, you know, data is going to sit there unless it has a specific intent. I've made up the equation RWE plus I equal RWD plus I. So I with meaning intent makes it evidence. Yeah. But evidence is going to sit there unless you really understand who is going to be informed by that evidence. Who are the key stakeholders? I talk a lot about evidence and engagement at the same time. So even evidence by itself is not going to be all that informative unless you've really engaged with those stakeholders and prepared them for this evidence. So I you know, again, when we think about the ROI, there's probably another equation there, but it's evidence and engagement. I think that sometimes the engagement part gets lost when we get into methodological issues.
Yeah, and oh God, we haven't got time for that, but you know, from our perspective, a tiny example, we'd love to do things in a really collaborative, patient-centric way. Guess why? Because you get better data and you do better research. But also, if you're a sponsor, you build those relationships. So don't simply think about your study as a means of generating real-world data. You can also generate real-world relationships as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we'll wrap things up there because we're approaching the hour. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and to thank our speakers, Mark, Akosua, and Jeff. We hope that everyone enjoyed today's webinar. If you'd like to watch it back at any point, you can find it on the VitaAccess website, and you'll be able to find all our previous webinars safe there as well. Let me just move forward here. One final ask before we go and say goodbye. As we reach the end of our webinar series for 2023, we're looking ahead to the topics for next year. And given your interest in RWE today, we'd be interested to know which RWE topics would you like to hear about more in future webinars. So you should see a poll coming up on screen at the moment. If you're able to just spend a minute to select which of those RWE topics you might be most interested in hearing about from us in the future, you're able to select more than one option if a few of those tempt you. We'll just give you a sec to go through those and then I'll share the results. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share a survey in the chat, which is a link to a more detailed survey asking about our webinar series. We'd really appreciate it if people have the time to just spend a few minutes on that, give us some feedback about the topics we're talking about and the logistical aspects of our webinars, to make sure that they are addressing your challenges, your interests, and that the series is meeting your needs. So anyone who has time to do that would really appreciate that. Just give people a second to respond to this poll, and then I think we'll share the results. Okay, let's see what people are interested in. We've got a winner here: patient collaboration in real-world study design. That's got 67% of our audience have said that they'd be interested in hearing about that. And then secondly, the practical aspects of incorporating RWE into your initiatives. So maybe Jeff will have to invite you back to talk a little bit more about that one, because I think we'd be able to get a lot of insight from you on that one there. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, and thanks again to all our speakers. If anyone has any further questions for us or for Jeff, here are our contact details. Feel free to drop us a message. And yeah, I think on that note, I will wish everyone a great day and say goodbye. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.